Some creationist muppet on Facebook recently said that microevolution and mutations is something that's been evidently observed. Macroevolution, on the other hand, has not, nor is replicatable in the lab. I hear this all the time, multiple times every single week at least. So we had a chat about that, wherein, of course, I had to explain what microevolution and macroevolution are, because creationists typically don't have any idea what either of those words really mean. And they have so many misconceptions about what evolution at any level really is. See, microevolution is variation within a species, a single interbreeding population. Like when an original group ends up distributed over a wide range, interrupted by a wasteland or a mountain range or a seaway. Mutations occur all the time. Literally every infant who was ever born is a mutant. Humans have an average of 128 mutations per zygote, and that's just what you start with, and you accrue more as you age. The vast majority of mutations are usually subtle, negligible, neutral. They neither add to nor subtract from your survival rate or reproductive ability. But a relative few significant mutations can either cause a detriment, which would usually be weeded out pretty quickly, or they might confer a slight benefit, so that may be impacted by natural selection, such that it may be enhanced or improved upon by later generations down the road. But understand that any single individual with a mutation is not evolution yet. It doesn't become evolution until that trait is inherited by their offspring and is then spread throughout the local group via population mechanics, generations of interbreeding with the others until that trait is widely distributed. And that's how we get such a variety of animals that are essentially the same, but that are also visibly distinguishable between this subset or that one, such that after several generations, you can tell just by looking which group some lone wanderer came from. That's microevolution, a buildup of mutations, different mutations unique to each group that are no longer shared with the other set, so that the two grow apart, becoming increasingly distinct, such that eventually every member of one group shares a particular trait that is not shared with any member of the other group. And this is how we recognize different subspecies under natural selection, or what we would call different breeds if they were derived by artificial selection. So, microevolution is variation within a species, and macroevolution is variation between species at or above the species level, which includes the emergence of new species when one species becomes two. When those mutations continue to build up to the point that these genetically isolated groups have grown so far apart that they either don't want to interbreed with each other anymore unless under duress, or if they do, they're no longer chemically interfertile and can only produce infertile hybrids. And of course, it continues, such that they eventually grow so far apart, so genetically divergent from each other, that they're not able to produce anything viable anymore. At that point, according to the biological species concept, when they can no longer bring forth fertile offspring after their kind, then they have become two different species. This event is called speciation, and it is part of the category of macroevolution. And what I've just described is allopatric speciation, which is the most common and probably the easiest one to explain. And we can see it reflected in northern and southern giraffes or in mountain gorillas versus lowland gorillas. It's also reflected in ring species. A favorite example of that are the Ensatina salamanders living all around California's San Joaquin Valley. As they slowly spread along that circular mountain range, they developed as a series of subspecies all along the way, which were fertile with each other, but once they closed that loop, they were too genetically different to interbreed with those on the original point. As you encircle this ring, subspecies A may breed with subspecies B, and B may breed with C, and C with D, but A and D cannot interbreed because by the time their territories overlap again, closing that geographic ring, they've grown too distant genetically and can't come back. The parent category of allopatric speciation includes a couple subsets. Peripatric speciation is when one small group is isolated from the whole, like if a few of them find themselves trapped on an island somewhere. The parent gene pool typically inhibits expression of new variants because novel traits tend to be drowned out over generations of interbreeding with the wild type, the more common and the standard form. And consequently, the larger the interbreeding population, the more impeded their evolution, whereas smaller populations in isolation will express novel traits more easily and will evolve faster. And the unique genetic markers that appear in these smaller groups become the founder effect of reduced genetic variation that is inherited by all of their descendants and are thus traceable back to this initial cluster of migrants or castaways or whatever we should call them. The new species being removed from the ancestral population is no longer restricted by the old parent gene pool at all anymore, and this leads them to evolve even faster until they build up a suitably large population of their own, and the cycle begins again. Classic examples of peripatric speciation include a collection of different species of crab spiders that are each unique to their own islands in the Austral archipelago. Another example is the London underground mosquito, which became a distinct species with its own unique behaviors and which is found only in that subway system. Peripatric and parapatric speciation are both described the same way, except where they differ in that the latter involves an isolation that is not necessarily complete, but that is subject to alternate environmental conditions, such that the species over here experience different selective pressures than the exact same species over there. Now, take, for example, Ridley's cave racer, a subspecies of Asian beauty snakes that are normally found in the jungle canopy, except that Ridley's beauty snake has adapted to living in caves where it eats bats. Another example is the Tennessee cave salamander, which exists both on the surface and in caves. And while they can migrate out of the caves and interbreed, producing hybrids with the surface dwellers, they remain two distinct species adapting to different conditions. And just for clarification, adaptation is not something different from evolution. In the context of populations, adaptation is defined as evolution via natural selection. So I could just as well say that the arboreal beauty snake and Ridley's cave racer are evolving into two different species by natural selection to the demands of different environments. There is also a form of grass called buffalo grass, which adapted to living alongside mine tailings. One species evolved a tolerance to heavy metals, which allows it to thrive on contaminated soils, where it doesn't do so well on non-contaminated soil. To each his own. And some forms of parapatric speciation lead us into a second category. Sympatric speciation is when some faction of the original population explores a divergent behavior rather than crossing a geographical boundary. And one example of that is the sockeye salmon, a migratory species of large salmon which spawn in rivers and lakes before returning to the sea. And these are the ones I'm sure you've seen in nature documentaries, struggling to swim upstream and spawn only to jump into a bear's mouth as the ultimate example of hard work leading to complete failure. However, there is a genetic subset of these called the kokanee salmon that are smaller because they don't put themselves through all of that labor and drama and risk. They play it safe. They stay in freshwater their whole lives where they can live more easy. Another example is the hawthorn maggot fly, which traditionally lay their eggs primarily on hawthorn fruit. However, once apples were widely distributed in North America in the 19th century, a subset of the hawthorn maggot fly switched to apples and became their own species. They still look the same, but the apple flies will not interbreed with the hawthorn flies. And probably the most dramatic example are the mice of Madeira. In 1419, Portuguese sailors discovered a few volcanic islands west of the Strait of Gibraltar. They settled around the area and accidentally imported a few European mice to each of these settlements. 5 centuries later, biologists discovered that these very small and isolated populations of island mice had evolved into 6 different genetically distinct species. They all look about the same, but the ancestral European mice have 40 chromosomes, and the Madeiran mice range from 22 to 30 chromosomes. They didn't lose DNA. I mean, some of their chromosomes fused, much like chromosome 2 in humans, packing more DNA into fewer units. And this is a different type of speciation because such chromosomal variants could still qualify them as distinct species, even if they can still interbreed. There are a few more examples we could list, but I need to get through the different categories. Next is artificial speciation, which is what we humans have done in agriculture and livestock husbandry and so on. We derived all of our domestic American cattle, Bos taurus, and Indian zebu cattle, Bos indicus, both from the wild European aurochs, Bos primigenius, a large and dangerous wild type that was driven to extinction in the 17th century due to overhunting and habitat loss. Similarly, you may be surprised to learn that corn is only 5 significant mutations away from its ancestral wild type, which is a form of Mexican grass called teosinte. Mesoamerican farmers sifted through generations of this grass, selecting and replanting the ones with the most and largest and sweetest kernels and so on, using artificial selection to turn grass into maize. Another really good example is the seedless yellow banana, a mutation which first appeared in Jamaica in 1836. Now, being seedless means that it couldn't survive on its own. But bananas until that time were tough to eat. You had to cook them first, and they were full of large, hard, noxious seeds. So having a soft tissued, sweet tasting, and seedless type that's ready to eat was an absolute treat. And what happened to the yellow dwarf Cavendish banana is the same thing that happened to the navel orange. We took advantage of that mutation and kept cuttings of that original mutant alive in order to market the seedless variety. And since then, many other cultivars have been developed from them, so that we now have the familiar 5-sided yellow banana too. When creationists ask for examples of observed speciation, they usually want something that happened under direct observation in a lab to prove absolutely that this begat that. But the laboratory examples don't often concern sexually reproductive animals. So they identify speciation by novel traits, genetic distinction, and the emergent process. In addition to the documented development of new enzymes and chromosomes, novel synthesis abilities, de novo genes, and retroviral resistance, some notable examples include the evolution of a new multicellular species arising from unicellular algae under direct observation in the lab. Now, taking all of this into account, most of the leading young Earth creationists have come around to begrudgingly admit that speciation has in fact been observed many times. Kent Hovind of Creation Science Evangelism and Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis have both admitted to this publicly. I don't know which examples either of them were thinking of because there are so many that they could be referring to. The problem is that they will not admit that speciation is part of macroevolution, not micro. Creationists misuse these terms so that they can admit the extent of evolution that is so obvious that no one can deny it anymore, but they still want to deny all of the implications that are extrapolated from there. So the wanna pretenders try to redefine what macroevolution is, and they're inconsistent. Sometimes they mean millions of years, or they conflate macroevolution with universal common ancestry, so that they actually accept evolution almost entirely while still trying to reject taxonomy. But taxonomy is where these terms came from. When Carolus Linnaeus devised his systematic classification of life, he saw that everything was necessarily arranged in a branching pattern of multiple tiers of daughter groups descending from a series of parent categories in a branching pattern like a family tree. The issue for him was that this required speciation to happen, and not just once, but repeatedly, routinely. But Linnaeus was a creationist. He thought that new species could only come about as an act of special creation by God. And then a century later, Darwin proposed the first working mechanism to explain the origin of species by means of natural selection. Speciation is the most significant evolutionary step, and the level of species is the only taxonomic rank with a consistent definition. Though we necessarily have to have different definitions for whether we're talking about plants or asexual microbes or fossils. Not that all of that matters right now because we're talking about observed or otherwise verified speciation in living animals, and we're usually talking about sexually reproductive animals, which are all creationists care about. So we stick with the biological species definition, which matches the biblical description of kinds, by the way. Thus, speciation was always the dividing line between micro and macro.
Speciation does not count as macroevolution.
Yes, it absolutely does. The terms microevolution and macroevolution were first coined in 1927 by Russian etymologist Yuri Filipchenko. It was an evolutionary biologist who invented these words, so science is the authority on what they mean. According to universities teaching this subject, microevolution is variation within species, and macroevolution is variation between species. That means that the emergence of new breeds or subspecies is microevolution, but the emergence of new species is macroevolution. Creationists refuse to admit that that's what that means, but if you don't believe me, look it up. Macroevolution is evolution on a scale of separated gene pools. Macroevolutionary studies focus on change that occurs at or above the level of species, in contrast to microevolution, which refers to smaller evolutionary changes typically described as changes in allele frequencies within a species or population. Macroevolution is major evolutionary transition from one type of organism to another occurring at the level of species and higher taxa. Evolution that results in relatively large and complex changes as in species formation. Even though each of these is reasonably accurate, you can't always trust common dictionaries for lay people when they're trying to talk science. So sticking to strictly scientific sources, let's start with the University of California, Berkeley's online primer called Evolution 101. Microevolution happens on small scale within single population, while macroevolution happens on a scale that transcends the boundaries of a single species. Despite their differences, evolution at both of these levels relies on the same established mechanisms of evolutionary change. Speciation turns one species into two and is thus macroevolution. We get the same definition from Duke University: evolutionary patterns and processes at and above the level of species. And from the University of South Carolina, Beaufort, macroevolutionists study the processes that cause the origination and extinction of species. And from Stanford University, microevolution is defined as changes within a species that aren't drastic enough to create entirely new species. Changes that result in a new species are part of macroevolution. Now, let's look at the reference library Biology Online. Evolution happening at a large scale, e.g. at or above the level of species over geologic time, resulting in the divergence of taxonomic groups. Every such divergence begins with speciation, but creationists have already explained that they accept evolution even beyond that.
Probably the kind indicates somewhere around the family or genus level.
So Kent Hovind won't admit this, of course, but he accepts macroevolution, evolution at the level of species and above, including evolution at the genus level. And not only have we observed and confirmed speciation numerous times, but there are a number of peer-reviewed studies showing the observation or verification for the evolution of new genera, too. We got both. And then Ken Ham went even further. He said that he accepts evolution beyond even the family level, just as long as that doesn't include admitting that humans belong in the ape family. And that takes me back to that creationist on Facebook who said that macroevolution has not been evidently observed, when we now know that it definitely has been. Remember, he also said that macroevolution was not replicatable in the lab, until I told him how the evolution of the nylon-eating bug actually was experimentally replicated in the lab. And more importantly, I explained that macroevolution has been directly observed and documented many times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field, and that there are many ways to trace and confirm phylogeny. So he's wrong about all that, but he will not correct himself, because he's a make-believer, not a sincere seeker of truth, but a pretender whose strategy is to maintain willful ignorance. He's a muppet, determined to lie in defense of the faith. So his reply, unsurprisingly, was a straw man fallacy. Interesting. I've never heard of any organisms evolving from another. What organisms have done such a phenomena? Creationists use a lot of logical fallacies, meaning arguments that are not logical. They're invalid. In fact, their faith-based, science-denying belief system depends on illogical, unreasonable mental gymnastics. But this straw man is not just a misunderstanding. It's a misrepresentation, a deliberate distortion, a lie implying that the science of evolution says something or teaches something that it really doesn't say or even allow. The science deniers deliberately forget or ignore that evolution is descent with inherent modification, where one original population eventually becomes two distinguishable subsets over many generations. Instead, the believers insist on a Jekyll and Hyde sort of transformation, where one individual suddenly turns into something completely different from whatever it was, like a fish consciously deciding to grow legs and walk on land in a single lifetime. This development of legs in fish was a series for which we have several intermediate stages, each one involving multiple species over millions of years. It's not like a wolf suddenly gave birth to a terrier, a hound, and a molosser. But even if that did happen, it still wouldn't be one organism evolving from another. It'd be one form of canid diversifying into multiple subsets that are all still canids. It's like in the 1800s, the Chinese Empress Tzu Shi reportedly found a puppy with a birth defect that she thought made it look like an oriental depiction of a lion. And so she bred that dog with normal females until she eventually got more puppies with the same type of birth defect. And they continued breeding those puppies with other dogs that looked most like them until every generation produced the same weird-looking Chinese lions. And thus, they'd established a stable population, two of them actually. One is the Pekingese, named for the city of Peking, and the Shih Tzu, which was named after the Empress herself. And these are populations, not individuals. And even such a small change as this still took several generations, even with deliberate effort and a goal in mind. So deriving domestic dogs from wolves took a whole lot longer than that. Many more generations before people could easily recognize their dogs or tell them apart from wolves. In fact, that took so long that it's still ongoing. They're still in that process because wolves and dogs usually won't interbreed in the wild, at least not when they have healthy populations. And by that definition, they're different species, but they still can interbreed when there are no options or when the options are diminished and they have no other choice. However, the wanna pretenders refuse to admit the facts of the matter, insisting instead on distorting everything into something else. They want an individual animal to change into or give birth to another fundamentally different kind of thing. One so different from its parents that they're not even related to them anymore, like an elephant giving birth to a pine tree or a cornstalk sprouting hamsters. And both of these were suggested by believers trying hard as they can not to understand. And like this particular science denier on Facebook said, "The evolution I and most Christians don't subscribe to is one where man comes from bacteria or scum soup or, with all love and due respect to them, apes." First of all, we didn't come from bacteria, at least not as evolution is traditionally understood. There evidently was a developmental change there, but it had to be different processes because evolution is summarily defined as descent with inherent modification, and that requires an ancestor-descendant relationship, whereas getting from prokaryote to eukaryote involves a combination of endosymbiosis and a number of different types of horizontal gene transfer and some other things that we haven't figured out yet. And that there really is no single common ancestor of both bacteria and eukarya, nor is there any traceable lineage of proto-eukaryotes from bacterial precursors. In other words, there's no family tree there, at least not yet, unless you want to consider it more like a root system, because the tree of life evidently emerges from a network of myriad partial donors rather than any actual ancestors. But I don't expect creationists to understand any of that. Then, coming from scum soup is conflating evolution with a body of different origin of life mechanisms, collectively known as abiogenesis. Again, the sequence of multiple stages of unrelated chemical processes by which life first came about are almost entirely different from the processes by which already existing life then diversifies. Remember that evolution is the one and only theory of biodiversity, how one original species becomes 2, then 4, and 8, 16, and so on, via multiple branching nodes in a taxonomic tree of life. Finally, this guy says that the kind of evolution that he objects to is when it connects man with ape. That's when I had to explain to him that we are apes. And I gave him some links to look that up to see that humans are a subset of apes in the same way that lions are a subset of cats and ducks are a subset of birds. Being the smartest of all apes doesn't make us not apes. And we don't have to interbreed with the other apes. And ducks don't breed with eagles or penguins or with ostriches, yet they're all still birds. And likewise, gorillas don't breed with chimpanzees or orangutans, but they're all still apes, aren't they? Just like we are. It's not just that we share some of the traits that are similar to apes. It's that we wear the entire suite of diagnostic characteristics that classify us as apes. In fact, it's not even just that. It's also that we have the genome acting as a sort of paternity test to prove that relationship, so that we are apes both by definition and derivation, not just according to similarity, but the type of homology and also ERVs and so on. And it has nothing to do with what you want to believe. I know that an ape is defined as any member of the taxonomic superfamily Hominoidea, and that includes humans. I would have to knowingly lie to say that we are not apes. I won't lie, but creationists will, and they habitually do. In the end, I explained how macroevolution has been evidently observed and that we are physically, genetically, definitively apes. I told him that what he said earlier is factually false, and we all know that. Even he knows that by now, and it is time for him to correct his error and admit the truth of the matter. But of course he will not. I gave him no room to duck or dodge or obfuscate, so he simply disappeared, proving yet again how often creationists know that they're lying and just don't care. I don't know if there are any believers out there who are still sincere, who honestly believe what they say they do, and who think they have good reasons to. If you know someone like that, introduce me, because all I can ever find anymore are insincere idiots who are afraid to evaluate their own position, who refuse to accept correction, and who insist on repeating the same falsehoods dishonestly, intentionally, indefinitely, forever.